Hey, how's it going? Thanks for joining in. On this video, we're going to be picking up the series of looking through scripture to see what the teaching is about divorce and remarriage. This is the second video. If you haven't watched the first one, it's going to be on Mark chapter 10, and I would encourage you to go watch it because the argument made in this video is going to build largely off of what was established there. But for this one, as you can see, we're going to look at Luke chapter 16, verse 18, and see, once again, even though it sounds like an absolute prohibition of all divorce and remarriage, when we look closer, we can see it's actually not. And importantly, not treating this verse as the standalone, be-all, end-all conclusion to the discussion, but this is just one piece, namely the second piece, in an argument that's building as we look throughout Scripture. We're going to continue by looking at what seem to be the absolute prohibitions, and after going through those, we'll look at what seem to be the apparent exception clauses. We'll see what sort of doctrine we're left with at the end. So, brief recap, after the arguments made in the video on Mark chapter 10, we were left with a reformulation of Mark chapter 10, verses 11 through 12 that sound like this, where it says, "And he, being Jesus, said to them, whoever divorces his wife for any cause and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband for any cause and marries another, she commits adultery." And again, that "for any cause" is a reference to a specific form of divorce that was put forth by Rabbi Hillel that was very popular at the time. And so even though Mark's readers wouldn't be Jews, and so they wouldn't be picking up on this specific rabbinic teaching, what we can see is that Mark, by just the shorthand term divorce, is really referring to illegitimate forms of divorce. So what we see here as "for any cause" could also be read in whoever divorces his wife for an illegitimate cause and marries another commits adultery against her, and so on, because the "for any cause" is an instance of an illegitimate cause for divorce. So with that in the backdrop, we come to the scripture for this video, which is Luke chapter 16, verse 18. It says this, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and he who marries one who is divorced from a husband commits adultery." Once again, sounds absolute, but let's look a little bit closer. When we do look a little bit closer, I hope it sounds, first off, familiar to you, the first part of that verse. Everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. I hope it sounds familiar because it's almost verbatim what we see in Mark chapter 10, verse 11, which says, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her." Again, we see, except for maybe those last two words, this is verbatim the exact same statement. This is really important because when we looked at Mark chapter 10, verse 11, we saw that what sounds like universal prohibition against all divorce and remarriage, remember, was really targeted to illegitimate forms of divorce and remarriage. If this was true in Mark chapter 10 and Luke 16 is identical to Mark chapter 10, then it only seems most natural that what Mark chapter 10 is referring to, namely illegitimate forms of divorce, Luke 16 would also be referring to, which would be legitimate forms of divorce in virtue of their being identical. Seems to naturally follow logically. And importantly, if this is true about the first half of Luke 16:18, that the word divorce really is referring to illegitimate forms of divorce, then it only seems most natural that while staying within context, that is going to the second half of the verse, the term divorce would continue to mean the same thing, that it would be referring to illegitimate forms of divorce. So we have the argument that because Luke 16:18 part A is identical to Mark chapter 10 verse 11, then we can infer that they're referring to the same thing. And further, because Luke chapter 16 verse 18 part B is in the same context as part A, we can infer logically that what divorce means in part A, that is illegitimate forms of divorce, is also what it means in part B. With that being the case, we can then reframe the verse to be saying this: everyone who illegitimately divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and he who marries one who is illegitimately divorced from a husband commits adultery. This is really significant by itself, but it doesn't just stop there. It becomes even more significant more significant when we look at Matthew chapter 5:32, part B, which says, whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Again, this is almost identical to Luke chapter 16, verse 18, part B. But we saw in Luke 16:18 that what sounds like universal prohibition is referring to an illegitimate case of divorce, so marrying a woman who is illegitimately divorced. If that's true in Luke chapter 16, verse 18, it seems most reasonable to think that when we find the identical statement in Matthew 5:32, that it would also be referring to illegitimate forms of divorce. That is, it would be adultery to marry a woman who is divorced on illegitimate grounds. This is really important because Matthew 5:32 has done a lot of the heavy lifting in historical interpretations of this verse on the no remarriage view. But again, this is something that we'll touch on a little bit later. I just wanted to highlight that we're already seeing this verse, Matthew 5:32, might be saying something different than it sounds like on the surface. But again, this will be returned to at a later time. So, final thoughts. If you agreed with the argument from Mark 10, which seems to me to be very hard to get out of, is there a way that you can see to avoid the conclusions of this argument from Luke chapter 16, verse 18? Again, they seem to me to follow naturally and completely logically, that if what's true about Mark chapter 10 that I said is true, and Luke 16, verse 18 seems to be quoting Mark chapter 10, it seems like Luke chapter 16, verse 18 is also targeting illegitimate forms of divorce, not all divorce and remarriage in general. But above all, I just want to seek the truth, right? I believe God's truth will win out and it can handle objections. So if you have an objection that's meaningful to this argument I made here, please leave it in a comment below. I'd love to interact with you on it and see if we can get close to the truth together. Thanks. God bless.